Hi all, I welcome you to Microsoft Azure Pakistan Community September 2022 meetup. And there are some housekeeping rules that I would like to share before moving with today's session. We plan to meet up online at least once a month on Saturdays. The online meetings would be organized using Microsoft Teams. The online meetings would be recorded and later uploaded to Microsoft Azure Pakistan Community YouTube channel, so that those people who were not able to attend for some reason, they should be able to view the recordings. And I would request you all to please mute yourself during the session. The meetup time would be around 1 hour to 1 hour 30 minutes, depending upon how much time is needed by the speaker to complete their session. And there would be 10 to 15 minutes for QA in the end. And I would request you to kindly write your questions in the chat window. That would be really good. Microsoft Azure Pakistan community is also on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter, and these are the handles to our different channels. We are also present on LinkedIn. We are also on YouTube. I can share the link to the. I will share all these links in the chat window so that you could also look at them at a later time. And I will especially share this page for the Microsoft Azure Pakistan Community YouTube channel, where you can see all the previous session recordings that are available, and today's recording will also be posted here. There are some code of conduct that we need to follow because we are a part of Microsoft Azure Tech Groups. So there are some code of conduct that we have to follow in our sessions, and I will go through them. First of all, you need to be friendly and welcoming, be patient, be thoughtful how you communicate in person and also online, and be respectful and inclusive, and be open and curious, and reach out to the organizers if you need anything. Any information, or if you want to be the speaker in this forum, then please reach out to the organizers. There are some news that I would like to share. Microsoft Azure Pakistan community is now a part of Azure Tech Groups, and Azure Tech Groups is a global network of local user groups that are officially affiliated with Microsoft. And there are Azure Tech Groups all over the world, and they have a presence in around 45 countries. And there are in total 148 tech groups, and they have a member count of over 200,000. And this is a URL that you can actually click on to find out more about the Azure tech groups. And here you can see the tech groups that are in different countries, and all their meetings are also displayed in this page. So if you see here over today's meetup, Microsoft Sentinel Workspace architecture is also available over here. So all the groups that are part of the Azure Tech Groups, all their meetings are also displayed on the Azure Tech Groups page. Then moving forward and coming to today's session, today we will be talking about Microsoft Sentinel Workspace architecture. And Microsoft Sentinel is a SIEM and a SOAR solution. And deploying Microsoft Sentinel environment involves designing a workspace configuration that meets your security and compliance requirements. And in this session, we have the honor of having Peter, who will be telling us how we should architect and design the architecture of Sentinel Workspace. So we will look at the following common use cases that are cost, multiple tenants, compliance, and access. And at the end of this session, you will be able to get a better overview if you need a single workspace or if multiple workspaces are right for you. And Peter is a security consultant with over 10 years of experience architecting and securing and securing mission-critical IT infrastructures for various industries, both public and private sectors. And Peter specializes in Microsoft 365 security and Azure security. And Peter is currently based in Ontario, Canada. And here are Peter's email address, handle to the Twitter and LinkedIn if you like to connect to him or follow him or contact him. And thank you very much, Peter, for your precious time, and thank you very much for joining the Microsoft Azure Pakistan community as a speaker. And I'm very much looking forward to your session. So please go ahead with sharing your presentation, and now the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Uzar. I'm just going to share my presentation now. All right. So today's session, I want to talk to everyone about Microsoft Sentinel, more so around the workspace design and architecture of Microsoft Sentinel. And as Uzar mentioned, just a quick background about myself. So I am a cybersecurity consultant based out of Ontario, Canada. And my main focus is really enterprise security, looking at Microsoft 365 security and Azure security. And just a kind of quick disclaimer around it is any content presented in this presentation is of my own personal view and opinion. It doesn't speak to my employer. And I try to present the information as accurately as possible, but be sure to do your own validation and testing in your lab environment before implementing any of these solutions in your production environment. And again, I would like to thank Uzar and the Microsoft Azure Pakistan meetup community for allowing me to speak and present in today's presentation. In terms of the objective for today's presentation, as I've outlined, we are looking at talking about Microsoft Sentinel and around really looking at workspace design and architecture. I am somewhat assuming that you have
Peter,
a basic. Yep.
If I'm interrupting you, are you sharing your slide deck?
Oh, sorry.
No problem.
Forgot. So I do apologize for that. So kind of going back, I'm just going to do this a little quickly. Everyone can see, I'm assuming, right?
Yes, that's right. Thank you
Okay.
very much, Peter.
Sorry about that. So I'm going to do that quickly again. So I am based out of Ontario, Canada, and I focus on Microsoft 365 security and Azure security, mostly looking at large enterprises. That's who I work with. And I've been working with Microsoft technologies for over 10 years. And this is some of my information and background. And in terms of disclaimer, so any views and opinions of my own and doesn't really represent the organization that I work for. And again, I'd like to thank Microsoft Azure Pakistan community for allowing me to speak in today's event. And now coming back to the objective of today's call. So what I'm looking really here is to walk you through some of the decision points that you need to make when looking at deploying Microsoft Azure Sentinel and around the decisions for data, how to manage data, and how to manage the Azure Log Analytic workspace that goes along Azure Sentinel. In today's conversation, I am assuming that you have some basic knowledge of Microsoft Sentinel and some of the Microsoft Azure solution like Log Analytics. So this will be more of a 300 level talk, but don't worry if you don't have any knowledge of Microsoft Sentinel, that's okay. I will begin a little bit slow, go over some of the basic information around it, and I'll take you through some of the more technical topics around the workspace design. So in terms of the agenda, this is how the agenda is broken down for today's talk. I'll walk everyone through the overview of Microsoft Sentinel, just in case that you don't know the product, how it works. I'll walk you through the basic deployment of Microsoft Sentinel so that you're familiar with it. And then we'll start diving a little bit deeper into some of the concepts around data sources, compliance consideration, data access, how you will deploy Azure Sentinel Log Analytics/Log Analytics Workspace, if you have a multi-Azure region deployment, or if you have a multi-tenant Azure environment in your corporation or that you're managing. And we will also look at Azure Lighthouse. How do we, if you had a multi-tenant environment, or if you are working in a MSSP, Managed Security Service Provider, how you will leverage Azure Sentinel in order to connect to the different Azure subscription that you're managing. And number 8, we will look at some of the deployment considerations when deploying Azure Sentinel, when deploying Log Analytics Workspace. And number 9 is we will conclude by summarizing some of the main topics that we've talked about in today's session. In terms of Sentinel overview, so what is Microsoft Sentinel? So if you're not aware of what Microsoft Sentinel is a security information event management solution, or SIEM for short. And it is also have a component of security orchestration, automation, and response SOAR solution. So what does that, really mean in terms of what it does? So what Sentinel or a SIEM is, it collects data from the different devices around your enterprises, whether it is user device, on-premise data, multi-cloud data, and puts all that together under one solution in order for you to correlate that data and in order to detect threats and investigate and respond on any type of threat that might be happening within your enterprise environment. So that is a really quick high level of what Microsoft Sentinel is as a solution. In terms of, when you're looking at deploying Microsoft Sentinel, the deployment process is relatively straightforward. If we were to really boil everything down, what you would require is you need to deploy a Log Analytics Workspace, and then you deploy the Sentinel solution on top of the Log Analytics Workspace. You add in some data connectors, you create some detection rules, and then once that is done, you create some automation rules. So that all sounds super simple, right? And that's exactly what I thought when I started working with Microsoft Sentinel about 2 years ago. But as I, worked more and more with Sentinel, more and more with organizations, deployment requirements, different use cases, a lot of different things start coming up. And I started to require to look more deeper into some of these other things. So nuances to consider, such as acquisition, subsidiaries. What if the organization have multiple subsidiaries? They have multiple tenants. Do you deploy one Azure Sentinel? Do you deploy 2? And what if there is compliance requirement from the government, from the industry that they work in? What if there is separation of duty? Different team should not have access to the data within Azure Sentinel or within the Log Analytics Workspace. Data retention requirement. So this may be a requirement that's defined by your industry compliance or defined by your organization for how long you need to keep that data within Sentinel in order to discover threats that may have happened 6 or a year or maybe 3 years in the past. And then looking at cost. How much would it cost to store all this data to deploy a Sentinel for a really, really large organization? And thinking about regions, right? What if you had an organization that was in multiple regions? For example, Canada and Europe, United States and Europe. And then the last couple of points is thinking about log sources, coming from different log sources, whether it's multi-cloud, on-premise, and the last one is thinking about, Azure tenants, how many Azure tenants you have and how that all works into the design. So with that kind of said, I mean, there's a lot of components to think about when deploying Azure Sentinel. It is really not as simple as, my initial thought of Azure Sentinel, which is these 5 steps. There's a lot more depth that goes into architecting and deploying Azure Sentinel that is scalable for an enterprise environment. So now I'll kind of walk you through a lot of these details and the thinking process that I go through with my clients in terms of looking at how we architect and deploy Azure Sentinel for their environment according to some of these requirements. So the first thing that I like to look at is really data. I like to start with data. Basically, these questions are the ones that I start with is, what data will be ingested into Azure Sentinel? So is there a value to the data? So there's a lot of data you can ingest. There's a lot of data an enterprise will generate if you have IoT devices, whatnot. So is there a real intrinsic value to generate these data? Because it's not free. Anything that you put in Azure, it's going to cost you something. And these data add up over time. So you really need to look at the value of the data that you're ingesting. The next is really thinking about where that data is coming from. I'll dive a little bit deeper in later sections when we talk about regions, when you talk about different tenants, and then thinking about where would the data be stored, right? So we are looking at compliance here. Again, we'll talk a little bit more deeper about where that data is stored in terms of data sovereignty, and then how would these data be ingested? So there's different ways that you can ingest data within Azure Sentinel. So there's built-in connectors, and there's custom connectors that you can build with Azure Functions. And the last two pieces is really thinking about who should have access to this data. There's a lot of powerful information, a lot of confidential information within Azure Sentinel. So should all your team have access to all the data that's within Sentinel? And then how long do you retain that data within Azure Sentinel? Because again, cost is a factor. And then, you want to be able to keep your Azure Sentinel environment with as much relevant information as you need to do security investigations over time. So we'll start talking about all of these. And again, with the data, what I like to start off with is really the quick wins. So what I mean by quick wins is looking at data that you can ingest into Sentinel for security detections that are of two things: high value and little to no cost, right? So high value data sources where, I like to look at, which is Azure sign logs. You want to be able to quickly detect whether there is a compromised user account that are trying to sign into your environment. That is crucial to me. Office 365 logs, obviously email is a heavy target for any type of attackers. I would like to get some email information. And then if you're still running on-premise domain controllers, I want to get domain controller information because, again, that is a source of your identity, how people sign in. So these are kind of my high-value data sources that I want to look at bringing into Azure Sentinel for threat detections from day one. And then the second point is, if you already have a SIEM solution right now and you're utilizing it, you should have some idea in terms of what log sources of high value to you. And if you're migrating from an existing SIEM solution to Azure Sentinel, then you will look at which log sources of value to you and bring those over first to Azure Sentinel, and then look at some of the other ones that may not be as critical to your business environment. And the last point is really looking at what is free provided by Microsoft. There's a bunch of data sources that are provided free to ingest into Sentinel. And this is some of the lists that you can look at. A lot of these are security alerts, and some of these are, logs that you can bring into Sentinel free of charge in terms of ingestion. So this is another area that I'll start off with in terms of looking at data ingestion into Microsoft Sentinel as that first step. The next piece is really looking at or starting to kind of think about where is the data sources, and this will come into play a little bit more, or we will talk a little bit more in depth about it in later slides, is thinking about where that data source is from, whether it's coming from the same Azure tenant, whether it's coming from a different Azure region, a different Azure tenant on-premise, and how you will connect these data sources into Azure Sentinel, whether you will, there's a supported built-in connector, you need to create your own connector, and the cost associated with it. Again, we'll dive a lot deeper into it, but these are topics that you need to consider when you're looking at data sources bringing into Azure Sentinel. What I like to do is visually for myself, I like to create a spreadsheet similar to this for me to have an idea in terms of, the data that we're bringing in. If you can see my mouse move, I like to get an idea in terms of the data that I'm bringing in, for each of the role, the perceived value to the organization, whether it will have a high value in terms of threat detections, or maybe it's used for some other purposes, but it does create value for the organization. The cost that's associated with it, every organization care in terms of their budget, whether it's security or for IT, how much it will cost, consuming that data and processing that data within Azure Sentinel. So we want to get an idea in terms of cost for senior management. We want to get an idea in terms of where that data is coming from. Again, there's a cost associated with it. Same with region. We want to get an idea of what region we're operating or that source of the data is coming from. Whether there's a built-in connector or not. If there is no built-in connector, I want to be able to, if we are required to ingest that data, I want to be able to know how to build a custom data connector to get that data into Azure Sentinel. Get an idea of who would need access to that data, because, depending on the organization, not everyone should have the same level of access to the data that is stored within Azure Sentinel. Like I said, there could be a lot of sensitive information within Azure Sentinel that certain teams or parties should not have, free access over. And the last two is really think about your retention, whether there is a compliance requirement or a business requirement to retain your data within Azure Sentinel for a defined period of time, so that you can do security investigations, whether it's 6 months, a year, or 3 years down the line. So all of these should really be considered and looked at and discussed and defined when you are looking at designing and architecting your Microsoft Sentinel and Sentinel solution. Okay. Now, before I go on to compliance, I just want to run through a quick demo with you in terms of how to deploy Azure Sentinel. I forgot to do this a little bit earlier on the slide. I just want to show everyone how quickly you can deploy Azure Sentinel in an environment for anyone that hasn't seen Azure Sentinel deployment and how that looks like. So what I'll be doing is I'll just be logging into one of my tenant environments. I have a resource group created already, and there's really nothing in this resource group. And for anyone that's not familiar with Azure, all your Azure services are stored within a resource group. So I have a resource group here, and I'm just going to deploy Azure Sentinel. And all you have to do is really search for Azure Sentinel, say create Azure Sentinel. And what Azure Sentinel is, it's a solution that lives on top of Log Analytics Workspace. And I am just going to create. So I'm going to put it in that resource group, and I'm just going to call it Sentinel Canada Central. So now I am creating, it's going to validate first. So Azure is just validating that all the parameters that I put in to try and create this log analytics workspace is valid. Now I am going to deploy the log analytics workspace. So as this is deploying, I'll kind of talk a little bit more about it just in case anyone that is watching or currently on the call is not aware. So log analytics workspace is a Microsoft service that provides logging. Think of it, if you're not familiar with this, think of it as more of a database, somewhat of a database. So it stores logs within tables that is within the log analytics workspace, and solutions such as Microsoft Sentinel or Azure Monitor can leverage the logs that is within log analytics workspace. So you see that we have log analytics workspace created. Now I will click on the log analytics workspace and deploy the Azure Sentinel solution to it. So I'm just adding the Sentinel solution on top of the log analytics workspace that I've deployed. So this is going to take a few minutes as it deploys. So once it deploys, the Sentinel solution will be deployed on top of this, and we will be able to configure our log ingestions. And I'll show you that once the Sentinel is deployed. Log ingestions, I'll be able to create my detection rule based on the logs that are ingested into Microsoft Sentinel. The logs, you can create your logs to run on a scheduled task. So there's real-time detection and then there's scheduled detection. So you can customize the threat detections according to your needs of your environment. So once you have the detections created, then you can create automation rules to automatically remediate on those detections. So the detection rules are created using Azure Logic App. So Logic App is, I think they call it a low-code, no-code solution. So there's a lot of GUI that you can drag and drop to create your automation. So if you're not familiar with coding, Logic App is a great solution to quickly create automations. So now we have our Azure Sentinel solution deployed. It's really simple as that. Now, if we were to go into data connectors, this shows me all the built-in data connectors that comes out of the box from Microsoft. Now we can click on Microsoft Azure Active Directory, open the connector page, and I want to just say I want sign-in logs and other logs, and I will just say apply. So it's as easy as a checkbox to bring in these Azure Active Directory logs into Azure Sentinel. And then once that is done, we can go into analytics rules and start and create rules for our, newly ingested logs for Azure Active Directory activities and sign-in logs. So now, if you haven't seen it, that's really the nutshell of how to deploy Azure Sentinel in 5 minutes. So hopefully now everyone's experts in deploying Azure Sentinel. You can now go out and start consulting Azure Sentinel now. Okay, so coming back to our presentation. So now let's talk about compliance. So a lot of organizations, especially larger organizations or organizations that are in the financial industry that work with money, have heavy compliance in terms of the data that they collect, the data they store, and how they manage it. Even if the organization is not in the financial industry, as we're seeing a lot of hacks, data and corporate information is really critical. So one of the first things is I like to understand what type of business that they're in, whether they have any specific industry compliances that they need to meet, and build that into the consideration when we are looking at designing and architecting Azure Sentinel and Log Analytics Workspace. The other consideration we need to look at is the country of operation. Different countries have different, regulatory standards and requirements. EU being one of them with GDPR. America has, their own, and Canada has their own rules around data. and data sovereignty. So looking at the different countries that they operate in, and some organization, especially when we are looking at enterprise size organization, they might operate in multiple countries. So you have to factor that in, the different countries that they're in and where you keep that data, whether you keep all that data in one country or you break that data out between the different countries that they operate their business in. So it's critical to understand the business structure, the industry that they're in, and how they operate, right? The other one I haven't mentioned is subsidiaries. If they operate in multiple countries, is it all part of the same parent company, or do they actually operate as subsidiaries in the different countries? That's for more of a business legal protection reasons. So we have to kind of understand all of that when we are looking at deploying our solution, because all that touches the data that is stored within Azure Sentinel. And the last one is data compliance requirement again. So that summarizes what I've been talking about, is really thinking about the data compliance and the data that you're storing with Sentinel, and that meets the compliance requirement for whatever that is defined or whatever that you are meeting for your organization. Data residency. So when we are looking at storing data within Azure Sentinel, a big consideration is thinking about data residency, which is the most ideal case, and it is really to store the data within the country that is being generated in. And that's kind of the requirement that I've seen with a lot of the different use cases. So if the company is a European company, they would like to store their data within Europe in order to confine to European laws. Same with Canada, and same with the US, right? So if the company is a US-based company, the best practice is really to store that data within US in order for them to comply with those laws and requirements. And then the next one is data sovereignty. Is, for example, if you have an organization that is in Canada, that is only operating in Canada, but for whatever reason they have their data within US or within another country, that country may have a law that can't allow them to subpoena any data that's in their country. So for example, in the case of US, they have a specific law that allows US, if they suspect that there is any type of threat, that they can subpoena any data that is sitting on US soil. So, and I think that applies to a few other countries as well, is the country can subpoena any data that is sitting on their soil. Things to come to mind is a country like China, that have rules that allow them to subpoena corporate data if it is sitting on their soil. So that is something for us to kind of consider when we are deploying Sentinel solution. Is we want to think about the geopolitical rules that apply, and how we can protect the enterprises that we are assisting in order to confine to these rules. The next one is looking at regulatory compliance. Regulatory compliance could be, looking at how do we isolate the data and only provide the least privileges to the people that need access to the data that is stored within Azure Sentinel. If that is not a requirement, that it's not too big of a deal. However, as I see larger and larger organizations, that is definitely a requirement. If all data is stored within one log analytics workspace, they are requiring the least privilege. Not everyone should be able to see all the data that is stored within Azure Sentinel. And the other regulatory compliance is looking at data retention and being able to put and delete the data that is not required. So you're looking at possibly storing, retaining your data for 7 years. So typically within Canada here, we store our data for about 7 years. So this allows us to go back and look at any type of threat or any type of breaches that have happened in the past, because you might not be able to discover your breaches right away. In a lot of cases, you have threat actors that are in your environment for 6 to a year before you actually discover them. So being able to keep and retain your data within Azure Sentinel for a prolonged period of time, it definitely benefits you in order for you to go back and look at how they enter your environment and what was the breach and how that breach was caused. So all that has to be kind of considered. And we will look at some of the technical controls around this in the next few slides. So the next slide is looking at some of the technical controls, how we can configure some of these in terms of data retentions and controls. So the data retention for Azure Sentinel or the Log Analytics Workspace kind of breaks down into these 4. So you can control data retention at a workspace level. So you can basically say at a workspace level, all the tables that are in this workspace have this specific retention period. And as an example here, you will click on data retention within this workspace, and you can define how long you want to keep this data. So this could be 1 year or it could be 2 years. So this is on workspace level. Now, if you want to get a little bit more granular about it, for example, there's certain logs such as Azure Sign-in logs that you want to keep it for longer. But at the same time, there's other logs that you only want to keep it for maybe like a month. So in order to kind of control that, we will look at a table level retention. So this is a screenshot of a table level retention. So we will go into the workspace and we can, fine grain control the log retention. We will pick the log. Essentially, we'll pick the log table that we want to have better control over, let's put it. And we can customize the retention to say how long we want to retain that data and how long we want to archive that data for. So for example, if there's one, let's go back to the example of Azure Sign Logs. If we want to keep it for 7 years versus the default of 2 years, we can change it granularly for that one specific log table. And then the other one is looking at basic logs. So basic logs are logs that you can change. So you're only keeping these logs for a very short period of time. So these are looking at something like network traffic logs. You will get a lot of, but it's something that may not be as useful for you to retain for a longer period of time. So you can change this log plan to a basic plan. And archiving, we talked about, so you can retain your data and then you can archive your data. So general practice that I experience with here in Canada is we will, generally speaking, archive our data for a 7-year period of time. And that is data retention. And now we're going to talk about data access. So as we spoke about a few times during this presentation is data access. As we, smaller organization, I generally find it's not as much of a concern when we talk about should everyone, within IT have access to Sentinel, have access to all the data that's stored within it. What I find is as the organization grows, they become a medium-sized or a large enterprise-sized company, that become more and more of a concern. They really start look at least privilege and really control who has access to Sentinel, who has access to what table. Should everyone have access to all the tables within Sentinel? One case, that's really relevant is looking at should IT operations and IT security have the same level of access within Sentinel. And this is assuming that you have both IT data and security data going into the same Sentinel workspace. Now, again, as I mentioned, when you're looking at larger and larger organizations, the typical I see is IT operations team, so people that manage servers, will only have access to a subset of logs that are stored within Azure Sentinel. So things like VM activity that is related to the specific operation that they're doing. So this is just to help follow the security best practice of least privilege access when it comes to deploying Azure Sentinel and actually providing access to users within the enterprise. And last point is looking at really separation of duty. So not everyone should have the same level of access, looking at that. So if I was to kind of break down a little bit deeper in terms and look at design examples. So there's kind of there's three, but the quickest way for me to demonstrate this is using these two examples of deploying Azure Sentinel in the workspace. The first is around a decentralized design where you will have multiple Azure Sentinel workspaces that are deployed based on function. So you have one workspace for IT operations and one workspace for IT security, SecOps. There's pros and cons to that, which is the pro is you have that separation of control. So IT operations has their own log analytics workspace. They have access to that. They only have access to their own data, and the security have their own workspace, access to their own data. And then the other kind of advantage to that is you avoid ingesting Sentinel cost. So your workspace is not associated with Azure Sentinel solution. You don't have to pay for that Sentinel cost on top of that. The con to that is really looking at, well, obviously there's that overhead, right? So you will have to have two workspaces within your environment, and then you have to manage both workspaces, access to both workspaces, and you will not be able to kind of correlate data. So if you have some data that is within the security operations workspace, it makes it a little bit difficult for you to correlate from the security workspace. So being able to kind of correlate data across workspaces is kind of a con to that. So that's option one is one way of looking at deploying, which is kind of that decentralized solution where you're deploying multiple workspace because there is a separation of duty that need to divide control of the logs that are coming in. And then the option two is really looking at that centralized model where you will have one workspace and you have all the logs coming in. Regardless, I want to say regardless, but you have essentially all the logs coming in. In this example that I'm going to make, the most simplest is IT operations and IT security. So you have IT operation data coming into that workspace and IT security coming into the same workspace, and everything's together. So again, if we're talking about the pros is obviously from a security operations perspective, you are able to have access to all the data, whether it's security data or server data, like IT operations data. You can quickly search and correlate against all those logs. In terms of management-wise, this is what I see. So the question is, how do we control not providing access to our infrastructure, IT server admins, allowing them to see maybe some security information that they shouldn't see? So what we will do here is we can implement either a table level RBAC. I'll show you some examples in the next slide. We can provide table level RBAC or resource context RBAC to control that access, to limit who has access to which tables, so that different users will have least privileges, will apply to the least privilege, and they will only be able to see tables that they are required to see to do their day-to-day job. And obviously the con to that is all data that are ingested into this workspace that's attached to Sentinel incurs Sentinel costs as well. Okay. Oh, let's look at how do we actually control RBAC access to the log analytics workspace. So as we talked about, the decentralized model, where you have multiple workspaces. In the example I'm talking about, one workspace for IT operation, one workspace for IT security. What you will use is a workspace level RBAC. So on the workspace level, on the IAM control, you will control who has access to it. It's pretty straightforward. Now, in the next two is really looking at option 2, where you have the centralized model, where all the data is stored within one log analytics workspace. As I mentioned, you have two options, which is table level RBAC or resource context RBAC. In terms of table level RBAC, you are defining a very granular control in terms of what that end user will have access to, which table they will have access to. You will create a custom role. I'll show you in my lab environment how that looks like. You'll create a custom role, and within that custom role, you will define exactly what permissions that user will get and what tables they're able to read and get access to. So let me jump back into my demo tenant, and I'll show you an example of that. So if I were to switch tenants, and I'm going to log in with this user named Peter Parker, and Peter Parker is, let's just call him IT analyst, and he has access to our Sentinel workspace. Now, we don't want this user, Peter Parker, to be able to see all the security information that is within Azure Sentinel. If I was to kind of give you an example, we might be collecting sensitive information about a potential insider threat, a potential user that is that we are investigating, and they might be confidential information like that we don't want this user Peter Parker to see, but we want Peter Parker to be able to get access to logs for him to do his day-to-day job. So in this example, we have within the log analytics workspace, within the IAM control, we have a custom role that is created, and we call it limited log access, and it is assigned to Peter Parker. And if I were to walk you through this specific role, the specific role is, I'll go into JSON. So if we were to look at this specific role, we are only allowing this user to be able to do read access on the sign-in logs. And that's all they are able to do, and that's all they need to do for their day-to-day job. All they need to be able to do is get access to the sign-in logs and be able to look at it. They don't need to be able to look at all the other security logs. Maybe look at people's Office 365 activities or Teams activities. That's not required. So we want to be able to confine to the best practice of least privilege. So how does this look like in action? So if again, I'm logged in as Peter Parker, so I'm going to logs. And if I was to go in here, if Peter Parker tries to look at Azure activity for the last 24 hours, he's going to come back with nothing. If Peter Parker were to look at sign-in logs where he has access to, the result will come back, and Peter Parker is able to look at the sign-in log where he should have access to. So this is how we kind of create fine-grained policy around table level access and providing our IT workers or any people who needs access to these tables, these data tables, giving them just the right enough access for them to do their work. Okay, so let's go back to our presentation. So we talked about table level access, and the next one is around resource context RBAC, where you will provide a specific person access to the specific resource type. So for example, if we were talking about Peter Parker, he is IT operations, analyst. He needs access to all the VM data. We can control that and allow him to look at logs for all the VMs. As an example, that is a resource type. So we can control it based on resource context as well. The next one we are going to talk about is around Azure region considerations. So obviously, when you are looking at a large enterprise, you likely will not be operating within one Azure region. You might be working, within Canada, US, Canada, Europe, US, Europe. You'll have multiple regions within your Azure deployments. And there is a few different considerations when looking at deploying Log Analytics Workspace and looking at deploying Sentinel when it comes to Azure regions. So the first thing that I would like to understand is the different regions, obviously the different regions that the enterprise operate in, and how much data are being generated from these regions if they were to be pulled into Azure Sentinel. So that's the basis that I need to understand around the Azure regions. And why is that kind of important? Well, so the reason that is important is when you are sending data from one Azure region to another Azure region, if you're not aware, there is a cost to it. So for example, if my Log Analytics workspace is in Canada, but I have some data in US and I'm sending that from US to Canada, there is a cost to that. So what I can do is, if there's a significant cost to it and there's a lot of data that's being generated, I might want to consider deploying a different Log Analytics workspace in US to minimize the cost. So the best practice is to deploy your Azure Sentinel or your Log Analytics workspace in the same region as the data that's being generated. Obviously, that is not going to be possible for different reasons. So you have to take that into consideration when you are deploying and when you're architecting it. Now, the third point is within an Azure Sentinel deployment, you might be required to deploy a syslog collector to collect logs from your firewall that's coming from on-premise, or syslog collectors that are collecting logs from other servers within other Azure regions. So the best practice, again, is to deploy your syslog collector within the same region. So on the left-hand side of the screen, where the syslog collector is deployed within US West, however, your Azure Sentinel subscription is in Canada East. In this case, logs are being ingested into US West, and then they are then being sent to Canada East. There will be a cost as the data goes across region. The best practice is to deploy your syslog server within the same region. If you look out to your right, that screen is you deploy your syslog server within the same region as your Azure Sentinel workspace. So this is just to kind of minimize cost. Now, the last point is, so this is really not a technical requirement. You're not required to deploy all your solution within one region. It's really to minimize the cost of the overall solution that you're deploying. So if you can't avoid ingesting, incurring on the data ingestion costs, obviously you want to avoid it. But if there is a specific business requirement that you need to have separate environments and keeping them separate, then obviously you have to incur that data ingestion cost for the sake of doing business. Next one we want to talk about is Azure Tenants. Obviously speaking, as we are looking at larger organizations, you're not going to have a single tenant, right? The organization can have a parent company and child companies that they operate, or if they're a medium-sized company, they might have made an acquisition recently that might have a different tenant, or they spun off another business that is running on a different tenant. So there are a multitude of different different cases, let's call it, where you will have an enterprise organization that might have multiple different Azure tenants. So how do we kind of think about that, and how do we deal with that? Obviously speaking, the easiest is if your organization is, a single tenant. All you have to do is deploy a single workspace. But like I said, it's in most cases, enterprises are not as simple. It's not a single tenant, and you won't be able to get away with just deploying one Azure Sentinel instance within it. In most cases, you are looking at a multi-tenant scenarios where there is subsidiaries or spinoff or acquisitions that are involved. In this case, you really have to deploy multiple Azure Sentinel instance per tenant, and there are some technical requirements around it, and you will not be able to avoid deploying multiple workspaces. So there are some, built-in connectors, built-in scenarios that will only pull data from within the same tenant. So if you are required from a security compliance requirement to monitor security for multiple subsidiaries, so parent company and child company, you will have to look at deploying Azure Sentinel for all those various subsidiaries if they're in their own tenant. Now, the question is, well, I have all these Azure, all these tenants, and I have all these Azure subscriptions deployed. How do I monitor all these Azure Sentinel subscriptions that are in all these tenants from one central location? Do I have to log into every single tenant and monitor the security information from every single tenant? And really the answer to that is Azure Lighthouse. So if you're not familiar with Azure Lighthouse, I will talk a little bit more about it. So at a high level, what Azure Lighthouse would do is Azure Lighthouse would, let me just go back a little bit. So let's assume the scenario is a parent company with a couple of different child companies. What Azure Lighthouse will do is it will provide the parent company access to the Azure Sentinel workspace of the child companies. So under one Azure Sentinel workspace in the parent company, they're able to see the detections of the child company as well. So they don't necessarily have to log in. So the security administrator from the parent company doesn't necessarily have to log in to every single child tenant's organization in order to facilitate on the security threat. So what does the Azure Sentinel solution provide? So Azure Sentinel solution provides that multi-workspace connection into that one central location. So it provides cross-workspace monitoring, cross-workspace queries, analytics rules, workbook, and hunting. So how does that look like from an architecture perspective? So from the architecture perspective, as I talked about, so imagine this is your parent company and these are your two child companies. Each of these companies will have Azure Sentinel instance deployed. As I mentioned, you have to deploy a separate Azure Sentinel instance per tenant. So you have 3 Azure Sentinel instances, 1 deployed per tenant, and they're connected via Azure Lighthouse. So the child companies, all that information can be viewed from the parent company as a single pane of glass from that parent company. And so this is where I will walk you through a demo of how Azure Lighthouse looks like. And hopefully, after the demo, it will give you a little bit more context into, the technicals of how Azure Lighthouse works. So I'm going to jump back to my demo tenant. So I am going to switch back. I am going to switch back. So I'm going to switch back to this guy where we recently deployed Azure Sentinel at the beginning of the presentation. And this is going to be my child company. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to connect the child company to our parent company. through Azure Lighthouse in order for us to be able to view. I'm just going to show you quickly. So the parent company that I have here is this one that ends in 110. And just to kind of show you how it's set up. So on the parent company, we had to do a few different things as a prereq. So on the parent company, and this also applies to MSSP as well, so managed service providers. So what has to be done is the parent company or the MSSP just give me 1 second. Sorry, I'm logging into the wrong tenant. So, okay, so I'm logged into the right tenant. Okay, so what the parent company or the MSSP will need to do before Azure Lighthouse is deployed is they need to create a few groups. So in my case, I've created a group called Contoso Sentinel Engineers and another group called Contoso Analysts. So the parent company or the MSSP can drop users into this, and these two groups will be used for the permission delegation through the Azure Lighthouse process. And this will come a little bit more clear. Let me show you the JSON file to give you more context into how this works. So you will have these two groups created and users will be added to these groups. The parent company or the MSSP then will need to create these JSON files, these ARM templates, to define how the client or the child company would connect to the parent company. So within here, what is defined is the tenant of the parent company or the MSSP, the roles and access that will be given. In this case, this principal ID maps back. So if I was to scroll out here, so this principal ID on the JSON file maps back to this group name, so analysts. And then there is a role permission that's assigned to this analyst group. So that is all defined. So bottom here, we see engineer access. So this group corresponds to this object ID. So here in this JSON file, we're just defining which of the group within our parent tenant are being used to delegate access. And then we are defining what access we are providing to these two groups. So that all this information along with the tenant information are defined within this JSON file. So there is two files that will need to be given to the child company or to a client if it's MSSP. So these two files will be given to them. And what they will need to do is they will need to load it into their Azure tenants in order for that Azure Lighthouse connection to be established. So let me kind of walk you through that. So there's essentially three ways you can do it. I'll walk you through the PowerShell way. I'm just going to load up my PowerShell. So what I will do, so imagine this is a child company. What they will do is they would run the PowerShell. So they will connect to their tenants. Okay. Just going to put in my username credential so that they're now connected. They will need to, if it's the first time that they're doing it, they will need to register the the management service. So that is going to take a few minutes for that management service to register within the Sentinel tenant. And the next one is they will need to run a specific command. So they will have to have these JSON files stored, and then they will need to run a command to deploy. So it looks like that. So they will need to run a command to deploy the Azure Lighthouse solution to the specific location, and then including the location of the 2 JSON files that I showed you earlier. And within the JSON file, it defines, who that MSSP is, what the tenant ID of the MSSP or the parent company is to connect to. And then again, within that JSON file, it defines what roles the groups will have access to the child company or to the client's tenant. So that is going to take a few minutes to run. So now that you see it successfully run, it connected the child tenant to the parent tenant, and all that information provided. It's going to take a few minutes for the 2 tenant for that information to propagate. So I'm just going to let it sit for a while. I'll come back to this demo and show you a little bit more about it. So let's just go back to our presentation. So again, this is really to allow you to, be able to kind of connect the child tenant or the subsidiaries back into the parent organization. Or if you're doing a MSSP, you're able to connect all your clients into your managed service provider that wants Azure Sentinel control, and for you to kind of control all that security from one central location. And when we are looking at deployment best practices, what I like to kind of consider is deploying Azure Sentinel within its own management group or within its own Azure subscription, and then looking at providing access to Azure resource group that is dedicated to Azure Sentinel. So how does that look like? So in this scenario, architecture for management group and Azure landing zone as a kind of a rough example, the best practice is to have a separate, if you can have a separate management group for security. The next best thing is to have a separate subscription for Azure Security. So this way you can control the level of access to all your security related Azure resources under one kind of branch that is separate from your other Azure resources, such as your production landing zone. So that provides a better level of security control. So the best way to summarize, the best way is thinking about a separate management group for security. If you can't, separate subscription. The least is you have all your security stuff within a resource, within the same resource group. So that's kind of a deployment consideration to look at. The next one is if you have both Microsoft Defender for Cloud and Azure Sentinel, try to use the same workspace. So by default, Microsoft Defender for Cloud, which is Microsoft security and multi-cloud monitoring solution, also uses a log analytics workspace. When you deploy Microsoft Defender for Cloud, it will likely create a default workspace that is separate from your Azure Sentinel workspace. What I like to do is I like to go into the settings of Defender for Cloud and make sure that my Microsoft Defender for Cloud is using the same workspace. This just helps kind of clean up the environment, putting everything together under one workspace that is shared between Defender for Cloud and Azure Sentinel. And then looking at your Azure resources and making sure all your Azure resources, so for example, Key Vault, storage, anything else, any other Azure resource that you want to be able to send diagnostic logs to Azure Sentinel, control all of that through your Azure policy. So create your Azure policy, define and make sure that all your resources are complying to your security requirements and making sure that you're sending their data to the correct workspace. So, in some companies that I've seen is they have multiple different workspaces. They don't know where certain resources are sending their logs to. They may be sending to a different workspace that has no Azure Sentinel on it. So use your Azure policy to check for compliance and make sure that all your data, if required, is sending to the correct workspace that is managed by Azure Sentinel. Now, before I come to the summary part, we are just going to go back to our demo. And I'm just going to wrap up and show you how Sentinel Lighthouse, Azure Lighthouse looks like. So again, we are just going to go back to the child tenants. So on the child, if I was to go to my service provider, I can see that Azure Lighthouse has run. Under service provider, I can see this is connected. I can see that the roles that have been assigned. So for analysts, as I showed you on that JSON file, so anybody that is analyst will have read access, will have Sentinel responder access, log analytics operator, reader access, and then if they're an engineer, they have a little bit more higher level of access. They have Sentinel contributor access. So all of that is, if I was to kind of bring back my JSON file, all of that was defined within that JSON file that was provided to the client or to the subsidiary. So all of that was defined here. So now once that JSON file is ingested and deployed, you can kind of see how that information it shows. So you see, from a subsidiary, you can see what the parent company has access to within my environment. And now let's jump back to the parent company. I'll show you how some of that looks like. Now within the parent company, if I was to come back into my clients, so I have to select all the tenants that I have access to. So this is one change that you have to make in order to be able to see all the subscriptions. Now, if I was to go back to service provider, go back to customers. So now I can see both of the customers. So another one that I've connected in the past for another demo, and then one that I connected today for this demo. So it's able to see two different tenants, and it has access to two different subscriptions, two different Azure Sentinel instances. Again, you can click on it and see what access level you have as a parent. So again, similar view, it tells you what group has access to what roles. And then within Azure Sentinel, if we were to go here, we see that there's two connected. This one was connected a previous demo, and this one's connected today. So I can see my multiple Azure Sentinel instance, and I can go in and manage it from that one pane of glass. So at a high level, if I was to kind of summarize it up, is really Azure Lighthouse is more of a delegation process. So the child will delegate access for a specific resource or subscription and specific role to a parent or to a MSSP. So that's how that process works like. There's really no portals or additional controls. It's more of a delegation process of one tenant delegating access to another tenant. And I talked about there's three ways of deploying Azure Lighthouse. So I showed you the PowerShell way. You can also deploy it through the portal, through the template, ARM template. You can deploy that JSON file through that. And then the other way is if you're MSSP, you can publish it through the marketplace, Azure Marketplace, and you can have your clients deploy it directly through the Azure Marketplace. And to kind of summarize it up is Workspace design, look at deploying to, if you have a single tenant, really looking at deploy a single workspace per tenant. However, if you're operating in multiple regions, you might have to look at deploying, your Azure Sentinel to the multiple different regions, depending on compliance and depending on your business requirements. Looking at, kind of that single workspace, single tenant. The pros and cons is obviously the pros if you have that single pane of glass, that single control. The cons is really that, data governance, and you might have to incur ingestion costs if you're operating one tenant but with different regions. So that's something to kind of consider as a con. And then if you're, deploying one tenant but different, if you're deploying Azure Sentinel to different regions under one tenant, so this is some kind of the pros and cons. You're avoiding the cross-region ingestion cost, but you don't have your single pane of glass unless you're using Lighthouse. So, and then there's a little bit more administration overhead because you're managing two different regions, Sentinel on two different regions. And this is the last one slide. We're looking at, having multiple different tenants. So this is the example that we talked about. You will connect all these tenants through Azure Lighthouse so that you will have that single pane of glass. But again, you will essentially have to deploy Azure Sentinel to multiple tenants. There's really no way for you to deploy a single Azure Sentinel that can manage multiple Azure tenants. And the last one is around Azure Sentinel architecture. So there is this really cool decision tree that is published by Microsoft when you're looking at deciding whether you need multiple workspaces or a single workspace will do. Different decision patterns, whether it's compliance reasons. So there's a link there that you can check out if you're looking to deploy or re-architect your Azure Sentinel Workspace. And that really concludes the presentation for today. So hopefully you have a better idea in terms of making decisions, how to deploy Azure Sentinel, and what to look for when you are looking at data and log analytics workspace when it comes to your architecture and deployment. That's it. Any questions for anybody that's on the call?
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for such a knowledge-intensive and a comprehensive session on Microsoft Sentinel workspace designing. It's no doubt a very important topic, and there are a lot of considerations in it. And I hope you will be sharing your slide deck with us.
Yes, definitely, I will do that.
Perfect. I'm looking into the chat window, and I'm not able to find any questions. So all those people who are connected online, if you have any questions, you can also unmute yourself and ask those questions. Meanwhile, we are waiting for questions from the audience. I have two questions, Peter, that I would like you to answer.
Sure.
As far as I have understood, Azure Sentinel is a kind of a tool that you could use for your cloud environment, Azure cloud environment, and also for the on-premise environment.
Yes.
But what if you are working in a kind of multi-cloud environment where you have some components on Amazon, you have some parts on Azure, and you also have some applications and systems that are lying on-premise? Can you also extend Azure Sentinel to look at the AWS environment?
Yeah, I can. When you're looking at, if I was to go back to my demo, so if I would understand your question is, how do we leverage Azure Sentinel to do monitoring for on-premise, like hybrid and also multi-cloud, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So the first thing that we need to look at is the data that are coming in. Like I've talked about within the presentation, the first thing we need to look at the data. The data, obviously, you're talking about from on-premise and from multi-cloud. And then the next part is looking at whether we have data connectors for those data or not. So in terms of Azure Sentinel, there are some built-in connectors for multi-cloud. So as you can see, we have some data connectors for AWS, and I don't work with GCP that much. Let me just double check if there's anything for GCP. There's only one for Google Workspace. So the first thing I will do is really understand what data we are looking to bring in from the multi-cloud, and then looking at whether there is existing built-in connectors for that data or not. In these cases, if you're looking at AWS, for example, there is 2 built-in data connectors for AWS that we can start bringing in data. Now, if there are data that you have on AWS that doesn't have a data connector that is built in, then we have to start looking at creating our own custom data connectors. So this gets a little bit tricky, where you have to create, as an example, you will have to essentially look at the API or look at how that data is produced within, I'm just going to use AWS as an example, within AWS, how you can extract that data, whether there's an API that's provided by AWS or bought by another SaaS company, how you can grab that data, and then you will have to build a connector within Azure Function. So that connector can be built through C# or through Python. What it will do is it will essentially utilize the API of that SaaS company to connect to that data, pull that data, and then put it into the Log Analytics workspace. So all that has to be custom built. If there is no built-in connector, all that has to be custom built within typically a function app written in Python, utilizing the API to pull the data and to put that data into the Log Analytics workspace. So once that data is in the Log Analytics workspace, then you can create detection rules and you can search upon it. So hopefully that answers the question for multi-cloud. And in terms of on-premise, it depends on the data source again. So we have to understand the data source that we're pulling the data in from on-premise. So if it's a firewall, things like Barracuda, if it's a Barracuda on-premise device, there's a built-in connector. We can easily connect it. If there is no built-in connector, then we have to deploy a syslog server, and then we'll have to pull in the data from on-premise as a syslog event. If it is a Windows box that is on-premise, we can deploy Azure Monitoring Agent or Log Analytics Agent to on-premise Windows servers. So you see here, so we can get security logs for on-premise Windows servers or Windows workstations for that matter by deploying the Azure Monitoring Agent on those servers, so we can start pulling in security events and other events from those endpoints. So to kind of summarize it up is, first of all, we have to understand what that endpoint is, whether it's a server, a SaaS company, what that data is, and whether there is built-in connectors. If there's no built-in connectors, then we have to build our own custom connectors. Does that answer your question for on-premise and multi-cloud?
Yeah, thanks, Peter.
Okay.
And my second and last question is that as far as I have understood, that the Log Analytics workspace data is stored in a kind of a structured manner, like it is stored in a tabular structure. So, is it possible for me to use some kind of structured query language to actually extract the contents of those components that I am interested in?
I'm not sure what query language are you looking for?
Like, can I use SQL to extract the data, write my queries, and extract the data from Log Analytics workspace?
Okay. So if I were to, let me just switch tenants. So if I were to go into, so all the logs, there's not a lot of logs here. I'm just going to log into another tenant with a little bit more logs to show you. So typically speaking, what you will use is you will use KQL, Crystal Query Language. I don't know if you're familiar with that. So it is similar to a SQL query, but you can't run SQL queries against a log analytics workspace. What you will run is you will run KQL against logs that is within the log analytics workspace. So in this example, this tenant I have a little bit more logs. Kind of diving a little bit deeper under the logs, you will see all the different tables, which corresponds to the different logs that I'm pulling in to this Azure Sentinel instance. So there's a little bit more. So I have security logs, I have heartbeats, I have all the logs. So what I can do is, so here is where you will define your KQL or Crystal Query Language. That's how you will interact with the logs that is within Azure Sentinel. So as an example, I can kind of say, I want to see, just kind of very quickly how that looks like. So I can kind of build out my KQL query to look for specific threat events or specific information that I'm looking for. Additionally speaking, you can export this data into other platforms, such as Azure Data Explorer, or if you're looking at, building out machine learning, you can export it to Azure Synapse Analytics as well. So it's pretty flexible. You don't have to keep all your data within Log Analytics Workspace. So you can export it, like I said, to Azure Data Explorer or to Azure Synapse Analytics for other function that you want to kind of incorporate and analyze that data. Yeah. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Peter, for your time and for such a interesting topic. I'm not able to find any question in the chat window, but I will share the link to the YouTube channel in the chat window, and hopefully by the end of day tomorrow, I will post this recording on the Microsoft Azure Pakistan Community YouTube channel. And I will also send a notification to all the group members that the recording has been uploaded. Once again, Peter, thank you so much for your very important time. And I would say that I hope in future you will also join us.
All right, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Have a very nice day. Bye.
All right, take care. Bye.